Hello viewers, welcome. Today we are going to discuss John Donne as a metaphysical poet and metaphysical poetry in general. So let's begin the discussion. What is metaphysical poetry? The term metaphysics means something supernatural and transcendental. The word meta means after, so the literal translation of a metaphysical is after the physical. Basically, metaphysics deals with the questions that cannot be explained by science. Its sense is that what is beyond physical is metaphysical. It is concerned with the fundamental problems of life and death and soul even after death. The term metaphysical poetry means poetry dealing with metaphysical subject. Subject matter of metaphysical poetry is the metaphysical subjects, and metaphysical poetry is a group of poems that shares common characteristics, common features like they are all highly intellectualized intellectuals, use rather strange imagery, use frequent paradoxes and contains extremely complicated thoughts. So these poets use paradoxes and their imagery is very strange. They are very intellectual persons. Literary critics and Samuel Johnson first coined the term metaphysical poetry in his book Lives of Most English Eminent English Poets. So he has written, Samuel Johnson, who was a great critic of 18th century. He has written a book called Lives of the Most Eminent English Poet. Here he has written metaphysical poetry. The term he coined this term metaphysical poetry. In the book, Johnson wrote about a group of 17th century British poets that included John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell, and Henry Vaughan. He noted how the poets shared many common characteristics, especially one of wit and elaborate style. In this essay and this work, he has written about all this, and he said that these all these poets belong to a group called metaphysical poetry. And first time when he used this term, he used in a derogatory sense. Means he was criticizing these poets that these poets are not writing in a conventional style. They are not writing in a good style and natural style. Their poetry is artificial and all that. But afterward, this poetry became very very popular in 20th century, and now it is still very popular with readers. Metaphysical poetry also sought to shock the reader. It kind of shocked the reader and wake him or her up from his normal existence in order to question the unquestionable. So this is a startling kind of poetry is there. There is an abrupt beginning. For instance, in the Dawn poetry canonization, he writes that, "Oh, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." So he is telling his friend that you don't talk anything about me, just let me love. So this is a very startling beginning. The poetry often mixed ordinary speech with paradoxes and puns. They always uses paradoxes and puns, all these figure of speeches. The result were strange, and because of using all this, the outcome of the poetry is very strange. And comparing unlikely things, they compare very things which are not easily compared. They compare things like that, such as lover to the compass. So John Donne has compared lovers with a compass, geometry compass, and not with roses, or the soul to drop of dew, and he compared soul to the drop of dew. These weird comparisons and strange comparisons were called conceits. These are called conceit. Conceit means far-fetched comparisons. Comparison which is very strange. Metaphysical poetry also explored a few common themes. They have common themes like they all had a religious sentiments. Some poetry is also irreligious also. In addition, many of the poems explored in the theme of the carpe diem. So their theme is carpe diem, means seize the moment. Carpe diem means related to opportunism. Like metaphysical poets also employed a carpe diem philosophy. It is a philosophy of opportunism. Means make hay while the sun shines. That means make most of the moment, present moment, and investigated the humanity of life. These are the famous metaphysical poets: John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Saint Robert, Richard Crashaw, Thomas Trenham, Henry Vaughan. Devices used in metaphysical poetry. Now, what are the devices? What are the elements of metaphysical poetry? Metaphysical poets like John Donne use complex dramatic expressions and variety of literary devices like extended conceit, paradoxes, and imagery in a colloquial style and personal language that challenges ideas of morality. So, their style of writing is very colloquial, very conversational. You will feel that you are not reading a poetry, you are reading in conversation, and so their style is very like that. Traditional love and carnality is not there. It is intellectually imaginative. It is very intellectual and it is very imaginative and very innovative, a kind of poetry, even jarring sometimes, because it is mixes and links two unlikely things to create extended metaphors and anecdotes that is unique in comparison to previous poets. So they were using things which were not used earlier by the earlier poets in that century. Earlier from them, that John belonged to Jacobean age, and in the Elizabethan age, people were using that patriarchian conceit. The conceit means conceit is what? Conceit means bringing together two dissimilar elements. As Dr. Johnson said that a metaphysical conceit yoke together two dissimilar elements by violence. So, when Petrarchan sonnets were used, where Petrarchan's conceit were used, they compared together two dissimilar elements in a very, very romantic way. The Petrarchan sonneteer will say, "My mistress' eyes are like sun. When she closes her eyes at night, there is a darkness." So there is a darkness because of mistress is closing her eyes. We can't believe such kind of comparisons, and these are romantic comparisons. When she lets her hair loose, there is a darkness, and there is a change of season. When she smiles, spring comes. So all these things seems very artificial and very unbelievable. So Petrarchan concepts became very artificial, hollow. That is why metaphysical concept came in against that, and it works of John Donne. We can see all these things. They are shocking us into realization that these patriarchian concepts are untrue. Let us talk about the struggle of life. Let us talk about reality of life. Let's not cheat ourselves with all these romantic comparisons. Metaphysical poets like John Donne and others employed a conversational style, and their style is very unique. So, uh, a metaphysical concept is usually classified as a subtype, a metaphor, elaborate and striking, unconventional, they are very unconventional, or a supposedly far-fetched metaphors, hyperbole, contradictions is there, similes, paradoxes, and oxymoron. They use all these figure of speeches, causing a shock to the reader, and the reader gets a shock, foolproof shock, reading this poetry. The obvious dissimilarity, distances between, or stunning incompatibility of the object compared. So reader feel that this object are totally incomparable, but still poet is comparing those things. Like we can't compare lovers with compass, but he is comparing it. One of the most famous conceit is John Donne's valediction foreboding morning, a poem in which John Donne compared two souls in love to the points on the geometric compass. Here the name of the poem is valediction foreboding morning, and this is the compass. And John Donne has compared compass with lovers, and lovers with compass, you can say. Metaphysical poetry deals with the ideas, object that are beyond existence of a physical world. Metaphysical poets are interested in interplay between the world of mind, or the spirit of the soul, and the physical world. They often give concrete form to abstract ideas through their unusual images and comparisons. So their images are unusual, not usual, and comparison also. So metaphysical poetry was at its peak in the beginning of the 17th century in England. So this kind of poetry was written and it was in peak when there was a 17th century England. And T.S. Eliot is one of the many 20th century literary critics who helped to establish the well deserved reputation that these poets now hold. So, in the T.S. Eliot wrote a very famous essay. He wrote a very famous essay called English Metaphysical Poets, in which he praised metaphysical poets for unification of sensibility. So he praised them for his unification of sensibility, and they combined heart and heart. According to T.S. Eliot, their poetry is not just heart or not just head, but it is a combination of both. You can get emotions there, you can get thoughts there, and there is a creativity and criticism. John Donne was a best known metaphysical poet. He was a great metaphysical poet in this field. He was the pioneer of this kind of poetry. The other notable metaphysical poets were Abraham Cowley, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, and Henry Vaughan. The metaphysical poetry is characterized by intellectual tone, philosophical or reflective elements, new and original concept, wit and fusion of intellect and emotions. That is unified sensibility, which T.S. Eliot said, scholarly allusions, dramatic tone, tone is very dramatic, colloquial style, and paradoxes, relaxed use of meter, and all those are the qualities of metaphysical poetry. So, in this paper, important aspects or characteristics of metaphysical poetry have been discussed and analyzed with reference to the poetry of John Donne. So, we will analyze it with the reference of John Donne. John Donne is a leader and founder of the metaphysical poetry of school of poetry. His poetry is a revolt against the popular current. First of all, Dryden uses the term metaphysical for Donne's poetry. He used uh, he used this term for Donne's poetry, and he said Donne's affect metaphysics. As you can be bewildered that I told that Dr. Johnson used this term, but Dr. Johnson used the term metaphysical poetry, and here John Dryden said that John affect metaphysics means Dryden is John is not writing a good poetry. He is writing in a very pretentious style. He's affecting. He's acting metaphysics. He's writing very cheap kind of poem, very physical poem, and he's behaving as if he is writing a very spiritual poem or a metaphysical poem like that. And later on, Dr. Johnson called Donne and his followers the metaphysical poets. Okay. Now, since then, the word metaphysical has been used for Donne and his followers. So, since then, it is being used for Donne and his followers. The metaphysical poets were eclipsed in 18th century and 19th century by Romantic and Victorian poets. So in 18th century and the 19th century and all this in this age, these poems were not popular. Metaphysical poetry was not very popular in those days, and they were eclipsed somehow. But in 20th century, readers and scholars seeing in the metaphysical and attempt to understand pressing political and scientific upheaval engaged them with the renewed interest. But when 20th century came, there was a revival of interest in metaphysical poetry, especially due to essay of T.S. Eliot, who revived the interest of audiences and readers in metaphysical poets. Now, this is a very popular kind of poetry. Means people of modern age like this poetry very much. In his essay, The Metaphysical Poets, T.S. Eliot, in particular, saw in this group of poets a capacity for devouring all kind of experiences. So he said that they had all kind of experiences. Their experiences are very unique. The term metaphysical is applied to English and continental European poets of 17th century, was used by Augustan poets John Dryden and Samuel Johnson to reprove those poets for their unnaturalness. So when first John Dryden used them, John Dryden said metaphysics, and John Samuel Johnson said metaphysical poetry. They used that in derogatory sense. They wanted to criticize these poets. They wanted to say that they are writing in a very unnatural style, not in a good style. So they tried to belittle these poets. Now, Donne. Donne was the most influential metaphysical poet. His personal relationship with his spirituality is at the center of most of his work. So, spirituality is a very center of his work. He writes about spirituality, he writes about religion, and psychological analysis also there in his poem. Sexual realism of his work marked a dramatic departure from traditional gentle verse. So he was not writing, when he started writing poems, he did not write poem which was very popular in those days in Elizabethan age, like a very romantic poems. He wrote very different kind of poetry, in be in the field of religion, be in the field of love. His love is also different, and he is the person who went to jail for his lover, his love and his wife. His early work, collected in satires and in songs and sonnets, was released in era of religious oppressions. So his poems were collected in satires, in songs and sonnets. This were released and published in the era of religious oppressions, when there was religious oppressions suppressions going on. His holy sonnets, which contains many of the Donne's most enduring poems, was released shortly after his wife died in childbirth. So his wife died. He loved his wife very much and more. And when she died in childbirth, he used, and then he wrote this religious poetry. The intensity with which Donne wrestles with the concept of divinity and mortality in this holy sonnets is exemplified in sonnet X, Death Be Not Be Proud. These are famous sonnets of John Donne. Sonnet 12th, Better My Heart, and since she whom I loved hath paid her last debt. So these are the all his great sonnets, and I want to tell you something about this poem, this sonnet, Better My Heart. Here in the what happens, John Donne wrote Better My Heart, one of his holy sonnet, where he asked God to rape him, to ravish him. God, ravish me if I am a maiden, so that I will be chaste. So he's trying to God to say like that. Now who talk God like that? Only Donne can do that. Characteristics of metaphysical poems. What are the elements of metaphysical poems? We should cast a glance at the main characteristics of the metaphysical poetry before we proceed to examine Donne's as a metaphysical poet. Novel thoughts, there is novel thoughts in his poems, expressions, conceit, wit, obscurity, and learning are the main characteristics of metaphysical poetry. All these are the main characteristics of poetry, of metaphysical poetry. All these important characteristics are found in Donne's poetry, as we already discussed. All these are the elements of poetry, and all these are found in Donne's poetry and other metaphysical poetry of that time. Now, characteristics of metaphysical poem, what are they? There is a abrupt beginning. Like I told you in a canonization, there is a abrupt beginning, that hold your tongue. Then there is a language of the metaphysical poetry is a very colloquial. The use of consoit, metaphysical poetry, a dramatic effect that has been produced. They produce a very dramatic effect. Presentation of metaphysical poetry must be very argumentative. We feel that it is not a poetry, but it is an argument. Discussion is going on. Some discussion is going on there. Donne is a metaphysical poet. Now discussion will be there. When Dryden, Johnson, and Dowden called Donne a metaphysical poet, they refer to style of Donne. They refer that style of Donne is a metaphysical kind of thing. But when Dick Vancy disagreed with them, he toned up that Donne's subject matter is metaphysical. His poetry is a metaphysical because of his individualism and his quest for learning. So, according to him, his poetry was individualistic, and there was a quest of learning there. His poetry is full of it, full of wisdom. It is obscure, and reader have a difficulty in understanding this poetry. And it indulges in a far-fetched concept. It fuses thoughts and emotions. There is a fusion of thought and emotion. There is emotion is also there. And it is a logical, analytical, and mystical, and it is a very logical kind of poetry and very analytical kind of poetry, and it is mystical also. Now, learning. The metaphysical poets were men of learning. They were very well learned scholars. Their poetry reveals their scholarship. From this point of view, Donne is a great metaphysical poet. To show his learning is their chief subject and their chief object in his poetry, and in the poetry of other metaphysical poets. He has twisted his vast learning. We know that how learned this poet is. Due to this, his poetry becomes very difficult to understand. So there is so much learning there, so much wisdom is there, that it is hard to understand for a normal reader. In Donne's poetry, there is always a antithesis between natural and divine knowledge. There is always a difference and antithesis between there's a natural and divine knowledge. Then Donne's preoccupation with mortality. He is preoccupied. He's always busy with mortality and death. He always put all these things as a subject matter in his poetry. So all these things provide a very macabre element to his poetry. In his fine sonnet, Death Be Not Be Proud, he hates death and says, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. They thou shall die. So he is telling that that you should not be proud. Death is just like a short sleep, and when we wake up out of that sleep, that their death will be no more, and death will die ultimately. See here the picture. New thoughts and expression. Donne's poetry is a purely intellectual and witty, and it makes an appeal to the intellect and intellectuals. Intellectual people like his poetry. His thoughts are often new. It is not traditional at all. It is a very unconventional thoughts we get in his poetry. He has expressed his thoughts in a very unique and a very strange way. In short, he played with thoughts. He was playing with thoughts. He's playing with the wit. In canonization, the flea and the death be not be proud. We can easily find Don's new thoughts and expressions. Obscurity. Now, if there will be so much of strange thing, there must be obscurity also. So obscurity is one of the important feature of the Don's poetry. In his poetry we find obscurity. Ideas are not very clear, and vagueness of subject matter is also not clear. A common reader is not able to understand his poetry very much. This is linked with the sensibility of a literary wit and a philosophical conception. So he has used literary wit and conception are also very philosophical. So it is hard to understand. He frequently combines dissimilar ideas. Thus his poetry is harsh, obscure, and puzzling. Saintbury is right when he calls his poetry, calls him a very great and a very puzzling poet. So Saintbury was a great literary critic, and he told that John Donne was a great, and he was a very puzzling poet. Now, wit. Wit is one of the chief characteristics of a metaphysical poetry. This important feature can be found everywhere in Donne's poetry. It fashions his feeling and thought. Passion, sentiments, and sensuality are all subordinated in a poetry of wit and subordinated to wit. So all these things are there in his poetry. Like a passion is there, and sentiment is there, sensuality is there, and all these are. But what is most prominent is wit. All these qualities are behind this wit. His wit is unique in discovery of comparison and analogies. And when he do comparisons, when he does analogies, we can say that how witty John Donne is, and other poets of metaphysical poetry. This all these qualities are same with the all the metaphysical poets. But John Donne was leader in this field. It is a realistic and straightforward. His poetry is very realistic and very straightforward. It looks to run in side by side with a humor and irony. So it is not just that we find a witty element in his poetry. We get lots of humor and irony in his poetry. So he has all those elements also. The heterogeneous materials is compelled into unity by rapid association of thoughts. So these elements are heterogeneously put together. And so he has written a poem called The is a Flea is a very good example of all these things. Now conceit. Conceit is an important feature of metaphysical poetry, as we already discussed. What is conceit? Conceit is a far-fetched comparison, and so this is a where Dr. Johnson said that that said that metaphysical concepts yoke together two dissimilar elements by violence. And here Donne makes a abundant use of conceit. He uses a lot of conceit. It is an instrument to reveal wit. So this has been used as a instrument for revealing the intelligence and scholarship. The conceit is a comparison between two unlike objects or things. In short, it is a far-fetched comparison. Donne's concepts are far-fetched and his imagery is obscure. We have a lot of obscurity here. We can easily point out some of the conceit in Donne's poetry. In his popular poems, the flea becomes a marriage bed. It is a because it is a bites the beloved after biting the poet. So here this is a poem by John Donne, The Flea poem by John Donne here, and here he writes um, that flea becomes a marriage bed. Flea has become a marriage bed. It is because it bites the beloved after biting the poet. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. So now this flea has become a marriage bed, and it has become temple also of marriage. So this is a kind of sex also. He has written here like that this union of two bloods in stomach of flea is a kind of a sex. Now, as a poet of love, too, Donne is a very metaphysical poet. In his love poetry, we can also say see the metaphysical elements. For him, love is not a physical but a spiritual. Thus, it can be said that Donne plunged deep into metaphysical pursuit. He was a great metaphysical poet. His selection of subject matter was very good, and his treatment was also very great. His diction, his style prove him to be the very true and great metaphysical poet. So thank you so much for all listening to me patiently. Please like, subscribe my channel. Thank you.